What made you go back to politics?
Putin. I'll be very frank with you. Had Russia not attacked Ukraine, I would not have run for president of Finland. Every morning, wow, this is.
Have a seat.
Welcome to the debate. We're wrestling today with what seems like a real contradiction in modern geopolitics. It comes straight from the insights of Finland's President Alexander Stubb. Now, Stubb, he's a seasoned politician, and he masterfully navigated Finland's very swift entry into NATO. He called it a geopolitical necessity, given Russia's aggression. But here's the rub, the contradiction. The very same person who banked Finland's future on the strength of the NATO institution is also warning us, pretty starkly actually, that the world is plunging headlong into transactional nationalism. A world where, personal relationships and maybe short-term deals could start to trump these long-standing alliances.
Right. It sets up a real tension.
Exactly. So the issue before us today is this. Does the institutional strength of alliances like NATO inherently ensure their long-term endurance? Or are these commitments actually fundamentally vulnerable to the rise of populist, nationalist political leaders who seem to prioritize these short-term transactions?
Okay.
I'll be arguing that these institutional commitments, especially the ones formalized in treaties, backed by decades of military structure, they have an inherent gravity, a resilience really, that transcends individual political cycles. I'm sort of echoing Stubb's core confidence in that Western anchor.
And I'll be arguing the other side, that Stubb's own warnings about this paradigm shift, the volatility, the move towards bilateralism, that's the more pressing reality we need to face. This transactional trend, I think, makes institutional endurance quite precarious and could even lead to, a dangerous kind of complacency in countries relying too heavily on treaty assurances that might end up being politically hollowed out.
Okay, I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective here. One that's really grounded in Stubb's assessment of the ultimate guarantor state, the United States. He specifically stated, and I think this is crucial for my position, regardless of who is president, the institutions in the United States and the commitments of the United States to NATO will endure. Now, this isn't just blind faith, right? It's a deeply reasoned observation about bureaucratic inertia, about how these things actually work.
For Stubb, NATO functions like an insurance policy. That guarantee of Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, it's woven into the very fabric of U.S. foreign policy, military planning, congressional mandate. Walking away from a foundational treaty like that, it isn't just a matter of, tweeting something hostile. It would require dismantling decades of legal, structural, logistical commitments. The sheer systemic gravity of the U.S. defense apparatus, I believe, ensures the institution's permanence, despite the rhetoric of any single administration. Well, I come at it from a different way. Stubb's confidence in institutional endurance, it risks overlooking the very real geopolitical volatility he himself identifies. He's not talking about some minor political blip here. He warns that the world is experiencing a paradigm shift, a 1918, 1945, or 1989 moment. I mean, those years represent the total collapse or the complete reinvention of the global order. If we are truly living through an inflection point of that magnitude, how can we possibly rely so comfortably on institutions that were built for the previous, arguably more stable post-1989 era?
Okay.
The pendulum, as Stubb notes, it's swinging decisively toward transaction, towards nationalism, towards bilateral relations. And when he talks about diplomacy, he emphasizes it has to involve both state relations and personal relations. He even cites his specific interactions like a golf game with the previous U.S. president. That suggests to me that the personal political will of a powerful, perhaps nationalist leader, not just the institutional mandate, is now a critical variable driving security outcomes.
Let's focus, though, on the mechanics of enforcement, because I think that demonstrates institutional strength. Stubb champions the push for the 2% GDP defense spending target. Now, you might see the friction caused by this demand as a sign of institutional strain, but I actually see it as a vital self-correction mechanism. The fact that the alliance is openly, and I'd argue successfully, forcing members to engage in this necessary, maybe rough and tumble conversation about burden sharing, and that states like Finland are meeting and even exceeding it, that proves its viability. The institution is adapting, it's enforcing collective security, and that's making it structurally stronger in the long term, not weaker.
I am sorry, but I just don't quite buy that. The 2% target, yes, it's a measurement of spending. But does it really measure commitment or unity? My concern is precisely what Stubb identified, that Europe, and by extension NATO, risks living in la-la land, dealing with the world they want to see, not the harsh power politics world that actually exists. If leaders aren't grappling with the reality that power politics is back, then institutional assurances, well, they become a dangerous form of denial. When Stubb feels compelled to engage in high-stakes personal diplomacy, that golf game example again, to ensure the U.S. commitment, it really indicates that the personal, transactional factor isn't secondary anymore. It's perhaps the cost of maintaining the institutional commitment. The treaty might be permanent on paper, perhaps, but the quality and speed of its guarantee could now be seen as transactional variables.
But that argument seems to presuppose that these institutional structures are just passive recipients of political will. I kind of reject that premise. Institutional strength is demonstrated by the sheer necessity of the commitment. Look at Finland's rapid accession after 80 years of careful non-alignment. That wasn't just a whim, right? It was a stark realization that Russian aggression instantly rendered non-alignment obsolete, forcing Finland, as Stubb put it, back to where we belong in the West. This geopolitical necessity, it solidifies the institution's role beyond any single leader's personal preference or whim. The very fact that this massive geopolitical pivot happened and NATO absorbed it smoothly and quickly, that speaks volumes about its foundational, essential weight.
Well, I acknowledge the speed of Finland's accession does show the institution's procedural efficiency, sure. But I have to bring us back to the real-world costs of immediate power politics. Consider the very concrete example of the Finnish-Russian border closure. Stubb's government closed that border almost entirely in response to Russia's use of hybrid tactics, essentially halting institutional and economic cooperation that had existed for decades. It massively impacted communities like Lappeenranta. This stark action shows just how quickly state-driven security needs, reacting to immediate threats, can override decades of cross-border institutional and economic integration. Institutions just look fragile when faced with state-level hybrid warfare that demands immediate unilateral security responses.
That's a critical point, definitely. But I would argue that the border closure actually proves the institutional point, in a way. Finland acted unilaterally on its national border to protect itself. Yes, absolutely. But it did so under the umbrella of NATO, confident that its strategic pivot to the collective security framework had been secured. Its immediate unilateral action was, you could say, a tactical security move that relies implicitly on the larger, enduring institutional shield provided by the alliance.
I still maintain that the danger lies in this transactional nature bleeding into the core mechanisms. You champion the institutional mechanisms, but let's look internally at where Stubb himself says he's most worried. He identifies his biggest internal concern as the fragmentation of the European defense industry. He argues fiercely for a move to industrial-scale defense capacity across the continent. Now, that to me is a critique suggesting the combined EU and NATO defense architecture is currently failing at a fundamental industrial level.
Okay.
If the alliance can't overcome 27 different national procurement rules, if it can't standardize production to meet basic stockpiling needs when under threat, then how can its overarching political commitment, even Article 5, be considered truly robust? That fragmentation undermines the very industrial base that institutional endurance relies upon.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the fragmentation issue, while yes, it's severe, is precisely what the institutional push for the 2% GDP target is designed to eventually correct. You mentioned Lappeenranta and the border closure, focusing on the immediate state reaction. Now look at the institutional response, the demand for higher, more standardized defense spending across the board. This is the alliance structure itself, demanding that members correct these liabilities. The 2% target, even if it's politically messy, is the mechanism through which the institution forces members to harmonize capabilities and ultimately reduce that fragmentation. Finland itself, with its mandatory military service and large artillery reserves, demonstrates that the institution has successfully demanded a high level of preparedness and capacity from its newest members. This pressure proves the system is durable and capable of enforcing long-term strategic evolution.
But this pressure is also driven by fear, isn't it? Not just some smooth institutional process. Stubb notes that the U.S. push for 2% spending is a blunt instrument. And the reason it's blunt, I'd argue, is because it's fundamentally transactional. It sounds like a contract. You pay your premium, you get your insurance. In a transactional world, if that premium is deemed too high, or maybe the return on investment too low by a powerful populist leader, the U.S. commitment, while legally enduring on paper, could be severely degraded in practice. Through delaying tactics, maybe withdrawal of forward presence, or just strategic ambiguity. The institution might survive on paper, sure, but if its industrial and political machinery is constantly fragmented and held hostage to transactional politics, its effectiveness is deeply compromised.
We should also consider the philosophical grounding of enduring commitment, which Stubb interestingly ties to a national trait. Consider his definition of the Finnish cultural concept of sisu. He calls it calm, long-term, quiet resilience. Stubb frames this as the strategic antithesis of what he calls Putin's explosive, short-sighted aggression. The reliance on this deep, inherited national trait suggests that the Finnish approach to NATO is rooted in a kind of generational commitment that goes deeper than ephemeral political administrations. You could say sisu is the institutional commitment made manifest in national strategy, patience, long-term focus, and quiet preparation against external shocks.
That's an interesting point, though. I might frame it differently. Sisu, yes, it's an internal cultural doctrine, but relying on it could actually mask the external risks, maybe even encourage isolationist tendencies if the institution itself falters. Stubb is very clear that while everyone wants peace, Russia still has to show that it wants a genuine peace, pointing to its persistent imperialist DNA.
Right.
So, in a high-pressure scenario, if the U.S. guarantee under Article 5 is perceived to be wavering or slow because of domestic, transactional political calculations, a situation Susu ironically prepares you for, the natural response of a nation rooted in deep self-reliance might be to prioritize its own survival. Susu could, paradoxically, become a rationale for decoupling from the alliance's risks, turning the focus back entirely to national defense and self-sufficiency. That could potentially weaken the collective whole. The cultural trait, meant for endurance, might ironically become a justification for prioritizing the state over the institution if that institutional guarantee is compromised by political volatility.
But the institutional framework is designed precisely to prevent that kind of isolationist impulse. Finland's history, I think, shows that even with sisu, they ultimately couldn't survive alone against the scale of the threat. Their pivot was forced because the magnitude of the Russian threat required the collective force multiplier of NATO. The alliance provides the structure, the enduring necessity that channels that national resilience, sisu, into a collective strategic doctrine, rather than letting it curdle into mere isolationist fatalism.
My fundamental concern remains that a global paradigm shifts, as Stubb himself says it is, towards transactional nationalism, then the institutional commitment only holds if the external pressure doesn't completely overwhelm it, forcing members into that ultimate survival mindset. If the institution's effectiveness becomes contingent upon the volatile political will of its largest, most powerful member, then its endurance seems fundamentally precarious, regardless of how necessary the alliance appears today.
I maintain that the geopolitical imperative, the fact that nations like Finland view NATO membership as a necessity, not a choice, this reinforces the institutional gravity of the alliance. While external pressures exist, and yes, necessary internal frictions like the 2% target debate are real, the underlying existential commitment to collective security ensures its structural endurance. The system is reforming itself, it's adapting to fragmentation, precisely because that foundational treaty commitment remains paramount. It ensures the long game prevails over short-term political volatility.
And my position remains that Stubb's own realistic warnings about the rise of transactional nationalism and the fragmentation of European defense capacity suggest that institutional reliance alone is just insufficient. The alliance seems to be evolving into a more pragmatic, maybe less ideologically cohesive entity, where political personalities and hard economic metrics play an increasingly decisive role. We have to recognize that the treaty is only as strong as the political will of the leaders in office at any given moment to actually uphold it, especially if we are truly in a paradigm shift of, say, 1945 or 1989 magnitude.
We have certainly thoroughly analyzed the compelling and perhaps contradictory evidence provided by Finland's leadership regarding the resilience of these transatlantic security structures. The question of whether enduring institutions or volatile political will ultimately dictate the future of NATO, well, it remains open for interpretation.
Indeed. We encourage our listeners to reflect on the specific evidence presented here today. From the geopolitical necessity driving border closures and the resulting economic impacts in cities like Lappeenranta, all the way to, high-stakes golf course diplomacy. We want you to determine which factor you believe will ultimately prevail in this rapidly changing world order. Please share your thoughts and your analysis in the comments section below.
Yeah, we love to hear what you think. And if you found this intellectual exchange illuminating, please be sure to like this episode and subscribe to The Debate for more substantive discussions on critical issues.